the Speaker, I can tell you that both initiatives will deliver more than what that last government attempted to when, for instance, they put out a $1 billion infrastructure scheme.
Tēnā koutou, I'm Selwyn Manning and welcome to A View from Afar. And today we are joined by political scientist Paul Buchanan, and we will discuss how, wherever you are around the world, if you have not yet experienced the impact of supply chain pressures, then you soon will be. As 2021 edges toward a conclusion, everyone and everything is impacted by supply chain pressures. From you waiting for your online ordered products. We have all heard a lot about new world emerging in the post-pandemic period. But what will this look like? What impact will global change have on domestic, regional and global economies? And how will global powers react to a redefined world economic order? If change is coming, and it is, then how can the world re-emerge from this pandemic period and ensure progress and security are in sync? But before we deep dive into these issues, remember, if you are joining us live right now, you can then make comments in the social media platforms and we can include those comments in our program. But first off, let's move across and connect to Paul, who is waiting online, and he is going to help us unpack all of this complexity. Good afternoon, Paul.
Tēnā Selwyn, and now mai to all of our audiences out there, such as they may be.
You're steaming ahead with your te rero. Tēnā to you too, Mato, and looking forward to this episode. Ka pai, some big issues to unpack here, Paul. So first off, if we're going to look at this, let's approach it, Paul. And in our notes between you and I think we're right on the best way to approach this complex issue. It's from the micro to the macro. So to the audience, what we'll be doing is taking you on a bit of a journey on this. We'll be using Geo-Economics basically as a vehicle to transverse the consequences of the pandemic, the political impact, the economic impact, and the future of trade. So that's basically the program. And ultimately, we'll be looking at how this affects security, diplomacy, and defense policies for all countries going forward. So, Paul, that's basically the structure of the program. So let's do this, shall we? So we start off, let's unpack it from the micro point of view and look at this issue of supply chain bottlenecks, Paul.
Yeah, I think we have a good angle because we're, a very small market at the bottom of the world, but a country that otherwise should be pretty self-sufficient in a full range of commodities. And that's what got us thinking, if I recall, when we started talking about this week's episode. Yep. So basically, I'll start, when I say micro, from a household's perspective and quickly broaden it out. We've noticed here that groceries are increasing in price, or rather dramatically. And, it's been curious because vegetables in particular, vegetables that can be grown, albeit seasonally in New Zealand, are getting more and more expensive. And, with a growing boy in the house and whatnot, and by that I don't mean me, we got to feed him his veggies and stuff. So we've been commenting about that, and it dawned, again, my wife is a political scientist who does political economy, that it's not just that they're not getting supplies of vegetables that can be grown in Australia, which is the main provider of non-seasonal vegetables. It's not just that there's bottlenecks there, but producers here are hard-pressed to meet that gap in demand, so they're raising prices domestically in order to cover their profit margins. So we have both a shortage of vegetables, and then we have the price increases that go along with it, which contributes to the inflationary spiral that New Zealand is now seeing. You see, all over the world, inflation is rising because the cost of goods and services is rising. And here, we're headed to a record inflation rate, yearly inflation rate, which right now is at 5%. If we hit 5% by the end of the year, that will be the highest inflation since the recession of 2008.
And that's a big deal, isn't it, Paul, from the point of view of many countries around the world with these central banks. And in New Zealand's experience, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand has a legal obligation to actually keep inflation within basically a no more than a 3% band. That band is very tight. And we've gone over that from the point of view of problematic kind of pressures, obviously, on pushing that. And what does that mean for the average person? Perhaps those that already have their home, but they are stacked up with mortgages, etc., leveraged, from a pre-pandemic kind of period, as pressures relating to interest rates are incrementally creeping up. And there's something that I'll just get right back to in a moment, was something that Bloomberg in the United States actually touched on today, that where the inflation pressures start to exceed the interest rates themselves, then you're starting to get into dangerous territory, and New Zealand's certainly in that space.
Yeah, and one of the things orthodox bankers do, and our Reserve Bank and Treasury are orthodox, is that when they see inflation rising, they try to curtail the money supply. And the way they do that, the circulation of money is curtailed by raising interest rates.
The OCR.
Exactly. So, the reserve rate, which I think they just raised 0.5 point.
Yeah,
so
and yes, they did. This is before the inflation figures came out. The other thing that is, not escaping a lot of people is supposedly the bank markets have already factored these increases in. And yet what we see is every time they're supposed to be factored in, and now with this particular rate, the next rate is supposed to be factored in with the interest rates that are being applied to people. But when we see the Reserve Bank lift its OCR, or official cash rate, we see the banks once again leveraging on top of that. So I think we're in for a bit of a ride here. Yeah.
I mean, bankers, I'm not a big fan of bankers, but bankers remind me of the oil spot market. If you're the consumer at the petrol station, they're getting you both ways. They anticipate price decreases or increases. They pass it on immediately. And then they whine about lack of supply and what have you. So
I'll sit back and let you get back to your main thread. So sorry about those interjections, Paul.
Yeah, no, thanks for putting me up. But you made a good point, because that's where I was headed about housing. So I started out with just our household, situation. But let's look at a business model that has now been deeply impacted by global supply chain bottlenecks here in New Zealand, and it is the lumber trade, the timber trade, and its impact on housing in New Zealand. It works like this: years ago, New Zealand lumbering companies, they felled the trees, they chopped off the branches, and they milled them into construction wood, 2x4s, the works. In the last 20 years or so, what they've done is they still fell the trees and they chop off the branches, but then they send the raw logs to China, where all the finishing and conversion into construction material is done there. Then it is sold back to New Zealand, with the profits going to Chinese companies for use here in New Zealand. Well, what has happened? Not only do you lose the economies of scale, which admittedly were more costly. See, the reason that the Chinese came in and did the added value work is that they could do it cheaper and still sell back the lumber at competitive prices here in New Zealand. So that occurred for about 20 years. Well, guess what? There are now supply bottlenecks coming out of China because there's issues in China with regards to production of basic building materials. And the irony is that New Zealand already had a housing crisis before the pandemic hit, before these bottlenecks hit. But now that crisis is deepening because the cost of wood-based construction material and other materials as well has increased exponentially. So if you want to put a deck on the back of your house, much less, build a new rudimentary house, while you're standing there waiting the price, the ultimate price of that house to you is going to wind up costing 7, 8% more, maybe 10% more, through no fault of our own. But it was the business model of the day that is now found lacking. And this is the broader point, the immediate broader point. I think what we're looking at, Selwyn, and you and I talked about this last year, and I think we were pretty prescient about it, is that we're seeing the forced evolution of the global capitalist order. Why is it forced? The pandemic forced a rearrangement of the deck chairs, if you will. And now they're playing catch up, they're trying to mitigate, and for many, it will be a window of opportunity. I mean, this is an opportunity for many creative solutions to the problem of over-concentration of production and commodity supply chains under the previous, I won't call it a neoliberal model, but the previous market-driven model. And we're right in the beginning of that. We're now seeing, the warning is the supply bottlenecks. You know, capitalism is telling itself that old model no longer works.
And just for the audience's sake, you know, what we've seen in recent weeks is, for whatever reasons, we've seen the United Kingdom, for example, with not being able to access petrol at the petrol stations or the browsers, or gas in the United States vernacular. So, you know, and the lineups of queues of cars while people wait hours and hours and hours just to get some rationed kind of number of gallons or litres put into their vehicles. We've seen China, and we mentioned this in a previous episode most recently, Paul, with its inability to sustain its manufacturing base as it had expected because of its reliance on fossil fuel energy generation and the bottlenecks relating to importing coal, for example, into China has created problems there. And we're talking basic senses here. Looking at the micro, looking at New Zealand, we have heard in recent months that construction and carpenters, those companies that are setting up to do renovations or to build new homes, are saying to their clients, look, we can't give you a fixed price anymore. We just cannot do it. The pressures of inflation in the construction industry are such that it's off the scale. So we can't give you an indication of what this is going to cost you. And I know one of the building companies here, having dealt with them most recently, is saying, we can't actually take on new customers because we're so busy at the same time for another year and a half. Now, you know, I just wanted to bring those in on, you know, from the point of view of looking at some of the, you know, the things that we've observed from our living room chairs, if you like, in the last few weeks, and observing these significant changes where even the most neoliberal capitalist societies or economies around the world, in the through the pandemic period, have embraced Keynesian economics in various forms, albeit a 21st century version of it, where it's basically intervention and hands-on. But it seems that perhaps some of the arguments that are coming out of the big economic analytic platforms are saying that that stimulus is causing inflation, of which is destroying the global economy. All of these things, Paul, they do look like a reset is starting to shape, even if it's organic. Can you take us through what you think it might look like? We're not trying to be oracles here, are we? But if you can take us through what you think these kind of things mean and put it into a context for us.
Yeah, let me take a step back before I move forward, and let me run a little syllogism about pandemic, policy, and politics. Now, it's become clear that the Chinese were not truthful about the origins of the pandemic or when it started. It apparently started much earlier, but I'm not here to bash the Chinese. They were lying to their own people in the first instance. They were thinking about covering up and on the international stage. They thought they could mitigate it. Well, guess what? They did not. They cannot. And here's where we see its impact. So bad policy dealing with a natural, unnatural event. And one of the impacts of those policy is that people were continuing to get sick in new areas outside of Wuhan, so the industrial belt in and around Shanghai. And the Chinese Communist Party wanted to suppress the numbers because they wanted to maintain investment. And again, I think a lot of them thought that they could put a cap on it, that they could control the epidemic. Well, what do we see? You were very kind to share with me the Ministry of Foreign Affairs advisory on supply chain bottlenecks in the last week. And what was striking is in there, they mentioned the closure of the Shanghai air freight terminal in August of this year. That is the third biggest air freight terminal in the world. Billions of dollars in goods go through that terminal, and it was closed for an indefinite period for unspecified reasons. Now, one might argue, well, maybe there was an illness problem with their labor force, and that goes back to what we talked about last week. Contrary to what some haters said, that the Chinese were voluntarily complying with their emission control scheme, which is a piece of CCP propaganda if I've ever heard one. No, they had production shortfalls in part because many miners couldn't go to work because they were sick. They were sick in the mining regions. The Chinese Communist Party has not admitted that they don't have a lid on the coronavirus. And so their production shortfalls were due not only to a scarcity of domestic produced coal, but the labor scarcity involved in that shortfall, and they can't make it up with imports. So what I'm saying here is there are countries around the world which have suffered bottleneck issues in their domestic economies, but it has to do with the handling of the pandemic. Places like Brazil, where the president, who has now apparently been indicted for manslaughter or something for allowing hundreds of thousands of his country and fellow citizens to die, the president said that it was no more than the common flu. The core of his base are blue-collar worker evangelicals, so people of faith with low levels of education. Who are those people? Well, a lot of them work in the fossil fuel industry. Brazil is an oil and gas producing country, but also in the ports, in the transportation industry. So Brazil now has, their epidemic is still going full bore. And they now don't have truck drivers, they don't have stevedores, and these people are not only getting sick for weeks, a fair amount of them are dying.
Yeah,
so,
just picking up on that point, they're not alone either. Let's have a look at this. Now, this is a what Bloomberg calls a quick take on the situation here. The United States is recording some interesting things in the same way, and the viewers will notice this type of thing. If in years gone by, they've been able to enjoy perhaps purchasing things on Amazon or one of the other major platforms that feeds the world of such products, and at the moment the United States is starting to drag the chain on being able to get those goods across the borders and out, but it's also through the other way. And there are similarities in what you were saying with the United States presence situation on the Los Angeles side. Let's have a look at this. You check this out, Paul. Runs for about 2 minutes. So what we're looking at here, it's saying, the problem across the United States in a bid to ease the supply chain bottleneck.
So we're moving as fast as possible. Those 62 container ships at anchor right now have important parts and components that need to go to U.S. manufacturers, retail goods that have to go through the omni-channel distribution network to get to our doorstep or our store shelves. We're only 4.5 weeks away from Black Friday. We've got a lot of work ahead of us, but all of that conversation is pushing towards getting everybody to open up each day of the week. We've got to keep working as hard as we can to get these goods through the American supply chain.
I think we all understand that the whole supply chain in the United States, and in fact globally, was creaking along before the pandemic. The pandemic laid bare, with its increased volumes and with its different buying patterns, it laid bare a system that really needs to be modified.
So on that, Paul, a system that needs to be modified, and this is a common theme that is coming out of many of the, perhaps the capitalist-based type analytics and analysis platforms around the world. So if we are looking at this, we've looked down at that micro, at very, in the seat of the home type of situation. You've introduced into it these pressures that the big global super economies are experiencing. Brazil and its population, and albeit through the problems of leadership and politics there. We've looked at China and the problems that are there, and once again, some of the, put it in a succinct way, some of the mistruths that have been delivered to the populations of these countries. Look at the United States, where it's starting to look at the realities that supply chain efficiencies were under stress even before the pandemic, and the pandemic has exposed that, and a reset is needed. Once again, we're getting back to this whole thing. Do you think that any change to the geo-economics order, if we want to put it that way globally, is going to come by way of organic change, or are we just waiting on the verge of some bright person like Keynesian economics to kind of unleash a solution for our time?
Well, I think it's actually going to come internally. I mean, when capitalists start critiquing their own business models, that change is forthcoming. I'll finish up the bit about bad policy, bad politics. Remember that last year we talked about how the pandemic exposed the inequalities in pandemic mitigation. The rich got vaccines first, the richer countries got vaccines. There's whole parts of the world where raw materials are produced, where vaccination rates are really low. People are very sick, so production's falling. I mean, iron ore, coal, in places like Africa, the production's dropped dramatically. And so there has to be a policy response that, if not homogeneous and universal in application, allows the populations of countries to, get inoculated, become resistant with all the other prophylactic measures in place. And I say that not only because of the very uneven global distribution of mitigation efforts, but also because if you look at the United States, it's not quite a blue versus red state issue when it comes to supply bottlenecks internally. But what it is a political issue, because if you look at some of the industries, let's say the trucking industry, upon which the United States depends, a lot of those truckers are Trump supporters. And they've been fed a line that they do not need to be vaccinated, that their immunity will do it, and they cross state lines. What has happened is that now trucking companies are ordering their workers to get vaccinated. What's happened in the States is something that you and I actually mentioned, I think last year ago, April, which is under Trump, the U.S. government wasn't going to do anything by way of mandates and that sort of thing. So the private sector came in and said, okay, they're not doing anything, but we are going to suspend the sporting seasons, that sort of thing. Well, now the private sector is mandating vaccinations for its employees or they're gone. Well, a lot of these truckers are very political, and they're like, I'd rather not have a job than betray my convictions. Okay, whatever that is, until you can get vaccinated truckers to fill the gap left by those guys who are still holding fast on herd immunity without vaccinations, then you're going to have these supply bottlenecks. Now, getting to the issue of capitalism correcting itself, I think they've realized the fundamentals, which are the overconcentration of commodity production in a handful of nations, particularly China, and the fact that all the supply chains begin and end there has to change. And so that's more of a macro issue, but they have to change. You need now to move to a not only a diversified, but a dispersed production scheme. And I'll give you an example. Again, I'm not an economist, But you know how airlines move from point to point flying to hub and spoke flying. So you went to a hub airport, and then all the little regional flights and whatnot, the shorter flights, emanated from there, rather than to fly, from a big city, let's say New York, to Topeka, Kansas. Okay, that used to happen, one flight a week maybe, but now,
in shipping kind of context, Singapore made itself on the global map by being the hub of merchant ships coming in and then dispersing out, didn't they? Yeah. Didn't it?
Exactly. Well, now what we have to do, I think, what they're going to look at is creating regional hubs so that you don't just rely, let's say, on China to produce some sort of plastic good, but you invest the money, let's say for the sake of argument, in Brazil or in South Africa, because you will need certain levels of skilled labor and that sort of thing. You put the money in and you do that around the world, so that way you have backups in case any one region suffers a pandemic, any one region suffers political strife. I'll mention geopolitics in a second. So I think we may be moving to decentralized production and supply schemes, and away from the model that has dominated for the last 20 years, would lead to that commodity concentration.
Very quickly, let's pick up on that point. And what would that look like for people? Are we looking at, for example, referencing back to New Zealand as an example because of its trade first type of foreign policies that it has had for several decades now. If we were looking at it as a commodity producer, and you were talking earlier on about New Zealand's examples of exporting logs to China and then importing back the value-added goods that come from those logs in the first place. So more manufacturing on site and on New Zealand shores, but also from and manufacturing wing actually responding, perhaps the labour force being able to enjoy the lift perhaps in wages in a way. Once again, we're looking at a micro kind of aspect there. But a commodity producer like New Zealand with its exporting of its dairy milk powders to China, are we looking at, for example, a change in the whole order? Only this morning it was announced a free trade agreement with the United Kingdom had been announced, where it looks like there will be zero tariffs on everything, because obviously the United Kingdom needs as much food and supply that it can get. But is New Zealand actually moving toward a value-added export economy as opposed to just a predominant commodity export economy?
Well, I think it's going to wind up doing a little bit of both. I mean, I think it's an excellent point, Selwyn. We're going to see a return, I hope, to more integrated manufacturing industries in a place like New Zealand. We're actually going to go back to that old model, but with a lot more automation, artificial intelligence layered in, that sort of thing, so that not only are the jobs, and all of that, but the profits all stay at home, which then can be redistributed through taxation and the like. The other thing, though, is we've mentioned Taiwan in the last episode, and we mentioned the fact that it's the largest chip manufacturer in the world. Now, here's where we get to capitalist logics, because it turns out when the pandemic hit in the North in 2020, the automobile industries dried up. I mean, sales of automobiles in the United States in June of 2020 were 60% less than of June 2019. So the chip manufacturers that produce chips for automobiles basically shut down production of chips made for automobiles because there was a surplus of chips. What they didn't think of is that with lockdowns and whatnot, people would then spend their money not on cars, but on consumer electronics, which also depend on chips. So all of a sudden there was an upsurge, and the chips are not that different. A car may need two to run different systems, whereas a smartphone may need one. But the point is that the electronics consumer industry rapidly gobbled up the surplus chips, and then the demands increased. And this year in 2021, when the automobile demand for automobiles in the United States began to rise, there were no chips to supply them. So now automobiles in the States are scarcer and more expensive when you can get them, because they're still waiting on the backlog of demand for chips to be satisfied. So I say Taiwan because those guys are very smart guys, and yet even their internal logics did not look sideways. They were looking at the auto industry and the demand for chips from autos and didn't think, you know, with all those people shut in, they're going to be buying, you know, big screen TVs, or, you know, smartphones, this sort of thing. And so now they're playing catch up with cars as a result of that lack of foresight. Well, I would say there's good news and bad news. The bad news is the Taiwanese have learned a hard lesson, and all of the people who depend on them, which is most of the world, for chips, have learned a hard lesson about not thinking just vertically, but laterally. I mean, you know, think about other windows of opportunity. But it brings us back to New Zealand. This is a moment, I said, you know, this is a window of opportunity for creative entrepreneurs. There is no reason with its labor force that New Zealand couldn't be the Taiwan of the Southern Hemisphere. Absolutely none at all. In fact, we have an overeducated population. We have a lot of university graduates who are doing the proverbial, you know, being a manager of McDonald's. We have too few people doing apprenticeships when we desperately need skilled tradesmen and the like. And it is very possible that as we come out of this, because New Zealand, unfortunately, we're in the middle of a tail of the epidemic that's wagging us pretty hard, at least up here in Auckland. But once we get through this, it's a time to reconsider not only perhaps integrating the economies of scale for the production of primary goods like logs, but also start thinking much more seriously about value-added production and producing skilled labor out of universities or out of apprenticeships that allow us to start competing with the likes of Taiwan. Because if we do, the overall price of things like chips will go down via the simple logic of competition. But more importantly, we are able to, let's say, do a Southern Hemisphere distribution network, which frees up the Taiwanese to increase sales to the Northern Hemisphere clients, and everybody can benefit as a result. So
now, Paul, you're a scholar. You're a scholar of comparative politics. If you look at all of this, is there anything going back perhaps to the Second World War period and the post-Second World War period, or anything relating to the political shifts from a geo-economic point of view or geopolitics point of view that you can apply here? And one, where could you expect the globe to be tracking as we look at this complexity of our age here?
Well, that's a really good point. Let me point out for our listeners that geopolitics is the relationship of politics to geography. Geo-Economics, which is not a phrase that we've coined, but which is seldom used, is the overlapping of geography with markets. And what we're seeing now is a shift in that overlap when we talk about geoeconomics. And what's going to guide that shift is the presence or absence of enlightened leadership, not just on the capitalist side. I mean, it's very clear, Selwyn. The Elon Musks, I hate to say it, the Jeff Bezos and whatnot, that's the future of capitalism. I mean, we're going not only automated, we're going into service sector dominant capitalism in many places. Again, we've already seen rust belts die around the world. This will accelerate. We need to think about that displaced labor. Where do you send? I mean, retail outlets. You and I back and forth a bit about that. The days of the retail outlet, with the exception of high-end things like luxury goods stores and whatnot, they're over. I mean, I happen to think we have this chain here called The Warehouse, which sells cheap goods, everyday goods. I think they're going to go fully online. They save themselves the infrastructure costs. They save themselves the labor and they just sell stuff online in the measure that the country becomes, goes further online.
And for the United States viewers, it's kind of similar to Walmart, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you take Kmart or Walmart, those guys are going to go online. And so then the question you have, but this is incidental to what we're talking about today, is what do you do with that labor? Excuse me. Where do the people, the cashiers, where do they go to get jobs once those places close? That's a policy issue. See, capitalists will move in directions where profitability is assured. They are creative, and we're seeing it right now. They will address and they will solve the supply chain bottleneck issues. Capitalists will do that. But it takes enlightened political leadership to encourage and guide them, maybe through taxation schemes, maybe through government help schemes. But the key here, which gets back to your World War II analogy, is we must have cross-party consensus in democracies for this to happen. Authoritarians will do what they do, and quite frankly, if you look at Russia today, if you look at Brazil, if you look at Turkey, they're not doing well because they lied and they cheated about the pandemic mitigation, and now those chickens are coming home to roost. But if you have enlightened leadership, and I'll use an example here. Unfortunately for the New Zealand right, the leading right party, National Party, decided to emulate Trump. For whatever reason, no matter how different New Zealand is, and the only thing that we have in common with the States is that we speak English. This is a different place. I try to emphasize to my American friends, you're not in Kansas anymore, Dorothy. This is Aotearoa. And National, they were beating this MAGA drum beat, and all they did is whine and whinge because the Labor government is very popular and very successful. But they realize there's a housing crisis, and they know that moaning about it is not policy making. And so we're starting to see the beginnings of a cross-party consensus about how to address this national problem. This is not a partisan problem. This is a citizen problem, if you will, if you're on the receiving end of it.
And it also gave the National Party leader some oxygen where she was being starved of it in the New Zealand news media. So it was almost like, here, we're doing you a favour. You can share the podium, not with our Prime Minister, but with our ministers in this thing, because we think...
Well, yeah, I mean, maybe there was some personal gain, some personal partisan gain. It's a win-win. Now, there is trouble when you allow the media to manipulate you. I mean, if it's true that the media is going, leader of the opposition, we're going to throw you a bone here. That's not good for that party.
No.
But let's assume that surrounding this leader, there are enlightened people who are like, look at some issues, such as what our economy is going to look like once the pandemic abates, is too big for partisan squabbles. We need to, just like the New Deal before World War II, before many of the Keynesian, you mentioned Keynes earlier, a number of European countries engaged in what were known as Keynesian compromises, where labor practiced wage restraint, businesses put their profits back into research and development. Everybody basically acted with restraint and in the mutual interest. Self-interest was put aside for the most part. They agreed for 10-year moratoriums on partisan bickering on core fundamental issues, most of which were about post-war economic recovery. Well,
and you're talking Bretton Woods, for example. Yeah.
Bretton Woods was an international approach, but even within countries, and I particularly think of the Nordic tier, so Sweden, Norway, Denmark, were remarkable in that they said, to come out of the war and be better than we were before, we got to stop arguing about little stuff and get with a national project. The irony being, of course, that the countries that had big national projects before World War II were the Nazis.
So what came out of that was, obviously decades of instability, of economic pressures that governments made decisions based on the pressures economically and also society-wise that they were experiencing over a long period of time. With this pandemic here, if you're standing back from this, I always find economics fascinating from the point of view of what pressures it provides or what facilitations it provides to society. And out of that, you see political responses coming from that. With this period of instability and uncertainty in the next 2 years, as the pandemic perhaps arguably gets to place into an endemic stage, and I'll leave it to the scientists to see if that's achievable. My fear, Paul, is that the big economic giants of the world will respond in ways of which are unpredictable or erratic or irrational, that even in the United States context, that a country that is so destabilized politically and polarized politically that you can't predict the outcomes 2 years away in such ways. What effect do you think it is going to have on the stability and security of the globe in the next 2-4 year period, Paul?
Well, I think that capital will flow to where it's used most efficiently. And that may or may not be dependent upon the political situation that surrounds it. So remember that old joke I told you years ago about being in Brazil when Reagan was reelected, and I was, crying in my beer about another 4 years of Reagan. And a Brazilian colleague of mine walked up and said, what are you crying about? This is a great day. I'm like, it's not a great day. Ronald Reagan got reelected. And he goes, no, my friend, you have to understand. Here in Brazil, we're waiting for a great leader to lead us out of underdevelopment and into the first world. But your country, a monkey could run the place, and it's a machine. It keeps on running. And the United States is a bloody machine. Capitalists in Silicon Valley and everything, I think they viewed Trump with amusement. It was literally like a monkey show.
Well, we did hear a bit of laughter even coming out of the UN, and it's not known for its comedy.
Exactly. He provided comic relief to friends and adversaries of the United States. Did he impact the economy? Not really, except he enriched the already rich. What impacted the economy was the pandemic and his mishandling of it. So in the main, really big places, let's say like Germany or Japan, they can go through political turmoil such as it is, not comparable to the States, and they're going to march along, as does the United States. But I think one of the bigger realizations is not so much for the real big producer countries or the very big raw material producing countries, many of whom are run by authoritarians, but think of it this way, again, getting back to New Zealand. Before the pandemic, we were told by the New Zealand tourism industry that it was absolutely indispensable to the economy of the country, that it generated XYZ amount of the GDP, that it was a core industry. We've now gone almost 2 years with that industry pretty much shut down. It has had no discernible impact on our GDP, none. What we have realized is that venture tourism is icing on a much bigger cake. It's a luxury, and quite frankly, it's environmentally detrimental. We don't need it. We don't need it. And those guys in the tourism industry who said that they were so indispensable are now crying in their beer because they're going to have to find other jobs. I don't think we're going back to the days where you have high-powered motorized machines blasting through pristine river gorges for the entertainment of Chinese tourists. Those days are done. And yet we were lied to by that industry, the cruise ship industry.
It is a significant point you're making, Paul, because it must be noted that in a country like New Zealand, the population accepted that tourism was like number 2 on its main significant economic pecking order. So it is a surprise, I think, to everybody to realise that the economy is actually doing very well, certainly amongst its OECD peers, without the assistance of an open border and facilitating a tourism exchange of foreign capital into the country.
Precisely.
So, you know, Paul, I'll place it over to you for a last word and a dig down deep into ultimately how does all of this affect security, diplomacy, and defence? That's usually our stock and trade on this episode and on this program of View from Afar. So how does all of this affect security, diplomacy, and defence globally, regionally, and inter-country wise?
Well, let me offer you a wartime analogy and see if you can see where I'm headed. Let's say that you're a submariner and you come upon two enemy vessels. One is a transport ship carrying supplies, munitions, goods, and whatnot to your enemy country. The other one is a destroyer. Which one do you shoot? You're going to shoot the transport ship. The destroyer is a danger to you. The transport ship is a danger to your country. And I think that the pandemic has revealed some inherent dangers in that supply chain to many countries in an increasingly divided world. You know, we've talked about the move to multipolarity. We've moved to the fact that there's now serious great power competition between the PRC and mainly the US, but not exclusively the United States. We've obviously talked about regional balance of power things. All of this has impacted the economic calculation in the post-pandemic world. If you're India and you're a rising power, you want to make sure that your supply chains are distributed, not concentrated in the event of conflict, and so on and so forth throughout the world. So I think that there's another meaning to the term geoeconomics in that the pandemic has revealed that the world is an interdependent but not necessarily cooperative place when it comes to trade, that there is hostility in trade, that there is, you know, that the competitive edge has a hard edge, has a sharp edge, I guess. And so I think what we're about to see is strategic moves made in various capitals, particularly of great powers and aspiring great powers, so Australia needs to be included in this, towards deconcentrating their supply lines, particularly of strategic materials, which are things like aircraft components and that sort of thing. And certainly the move, we haven't talked today, and we can leave it for another time, about the importance of lithium as a mineral. And the competition is on now for lithium because it goes into pretty much every modern battery.
Yeah, and overnight, Tesla, for example, announced that they were actually exploring a new type of battery to generate the energy, or to provide the energy for its vehicles going forward from here.
Yeah, I have a personal interest in lithium because the so-called lithium triangle, so think of the opium triangle, but a little different, encompasses northwestern Argentina, northeastern Chile, and pretty much all of southern Bolivia. And so the Argentines, and you know who controls most of the lithium mining in those countries? Chinese interests, Chinese mining interests. But I say that only because it reminds me of an analogy about shifting economic values. Many years ago, I studied under a fellow who was involved with the Manhattan Project. So the creation of nuclear weapons. He was a targeter. I may have spoken on the show about the plans to target Japanese cities. Hiroshima was not part of the original package. Long and the short of it, one of the things he mentioned was that once they realized the value of nuclear weapons, they determined in 1946 that in the entire world, there was 60 pounds of uranium. That's what the best science in 1946 said there was in terms of global supply. So the rush was on. And what do they discover? Uranium is all over the place. Uranium is, forget 60 pounds. It might be 60 billion pounds, but you have to go and look for it.
Australia did.
And Australia has. The point was, until they came up with weapons that could use refined and enriched uranium, there was no need for it. No one cared about it. Now it's a strategic mineral. What I would argue, lithium is the new strategic mineral, but more importantly, it points to the fact that economies are going to evolve around new technologies, new resources, raw material resources, as we move to solar, as we move to wind power and what have you. So I go back to my original point. We are seeing the forced shifting of the page in the book of global capitalism. Ultimately, that's what this is about. The pandemic has forced the change on capitalists. The capitalists otherwise were happy with the status quo under the previous trade regime. But those days are over, as we predicted last year. And so I actually see that capitalism will sort itself out. But here's where policy comes in, because we cannot go back to the situation of global haves and haves not and all their microcosmic effects. I mean, even here in New Zealand, a very egalitarian society has become much less egalitarian under 30 years of neoliberal rule. So one can only hope that the pandemic not only brings an economic transformation, or at least reconversion, but a change or a transformation in the humanitarian attitudes of capitalists and politicians alike.
Yeah. And then as we bring the episode to a close, I'll select a question here from a good old friend of mine, Wade Bishop, who is always a real thinker. And what Wade has put to us here, Paul, is the question. We'll get a response from you on this and then we'll wrap the program up. Wade says, do you guys think that rebuilding an onshore manufacturing base to mitigate such reliance on global trade is a national security issue for countries like New Zealand?
Ultimately, it is. Now, it's not as pressing an issue as it would be for other countries that are on the front line of the geopolitical conflicts of the moment. But let's think of it this way. I mean, I'm just pulling this out of thin air. But, you know, we pretty much dismantled the boat building industry in New Zealand entirely. And so our Navy is basically, its vessels are all built overseas. In fact, we've got a converted, I don't know if it's Norwegian or Danish, ferry is one of our largest transport ships. If we were to build boats on our own, think of the jobs. We could take foreign investment into that. Someone could make some money from the boat building project, but we would be building New Zealand specific, not always warships. I mean, you know, we don't have to go, you know, full cruiser and, you know, that sort of thing. We can have coastal patrol boats like the ones that we purchased, you know, most recently. There's about 6 of them. You know, there's many industries that we could rebuild that uses the skill base of the people at home, because that's the security issue, the foremost security issue. An unemployed population is a restive population.
And that's where the answer to that question is, isn't it? The emphasis on is global trade a national security issue for New Zealand. Manufacturing base to mitigate such reliance on global trade is a national security issue. And you're saying, yes, it is.
It is. And again, the primary reason being is that we put people here into well-paying jobs, making stuff that we otherwise would have to buy from abroad. It helps advance social peace. You know, people who are making good money, living decent lifestyles, again, that Kiwi egalitarian lifestyle. And of course, we have to remedy the housing crisis for that to happen. But if we do such things, we not only diminish our dependence on foreign providers of a whole range of products, but we put down the roots of a new social contract, a new social compact, in which people feel that they're getting their just desserts of their hard work. And then, yes, if you want to push to value added, the skilled labor provided not just by universities, but by apprenticeships comes into play. These are the people you're going to put to work. So it's not just fending off foreign enemies, it's helping promote social peace at a time where we see very wide income inequalities, even here in New Zealand. That's our first security problem, addressing the inequalities at home before we start addressing the foreign threats.
And this question coming in from a regular audience member of ours, Liz Hughes, and she's putting in, it relates to that question that came in from Wade Bishop as well. How will the pandemic create more equality? We've got enough time for a reasonably brief answer to that one, Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Liz, for that. I think that what it does is it makes us realize what is essential to the functioning of our economy and well-being of our people, and what is not. Like I say, adventure tourism and all of that, that is not essential to the well-being of the country. It's nice, it's a nice luxury, but it's not a core economic function. And so I think what the pandemic has done is it's revealed the deficiencies of economic models around the world, and by revealing it, you can see the potential remedies for those deficiencies. You see, that's the thing. We saw, New Zealand, I mean, we're doing a lot better here than many other places. But when you see inequalities in the distribution of vaccines based on wealth, right? This vaccine doesn't recognize rich or poor. And yet, in many countries, it was the rich who got vaccinated. Heck, the rich who went to other countries to get vaccinated. Those now have been laid bare in front of us. And so the remedies are there. We simply have to recognize what we're seeing. That's why I said in the beginning that, once capitalists realize that the model is broken, it will change, because they were the status quo. They were the ones who benefited from the previous system. They were the people who got vaccinated first. And yet, even then, they realized this thing is broken. So now it's for policymakers to start pushing those sort of remedies that will benefit not the 1%, but the rest of us.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for your company and your contribution today, Paul, and thank you to our audience for also putting things there. And just a very, very quick one, Liz made a comment. Tourism was one of the biggest earners in New Zealand, though, wasn't it, up close to dairy? Well, that was certainly the case prior to the pandemic. It's certainly not going to be the case as we go forward in the medium term at the very least, is it? We will be back again this time next week. That is around midday, Thursday, New Zealand time, which equates to Wednesday afternoon, evening in the United States on the Eastern Standard Time, for example, around 6 p.m. Until that time, we look forward to your company once again. Keep the conversation going online if you so wish to, and we will see you again next week. Take care. Goodbye.